The Coronation Hall was the largest room in the kingdom, and on this day every inch of it was filled. 1,000 bodies pressed together beneath vaulted stone ceilings. Candlelight from iron chandeliers cast shifting gold across the faces of nobles, merchants, guild leaders, and common folk who had traveled days to witness the crowning. The air was thick with perfume and sweat, and the waxy smoke of 100 tapers. Musicians stood ready in the gallery above, instruments raised, waiting for the signal. Banners bearing the Drakemere crest hung from every column, black silk with silver threading, and the dais at the front of the hall was draped in white linen so fine it looked like frozen water. Sable Thornfeld stood near the back wall in a dress that did not belong to her, borrowed from a woman in the boarding house who had taken pity on her threadbare traveling clothes. Her daughter Oriella stood beside her, 3 years old, barely tall enough to see past the hip of the merchant blocking their view. Sable kept one hand on the child's shoulder, a firm grip, a necessary grip. She should not have come. She knew that. Had known it from the moment she read the public announcement nailed to the postboard in Kaleworth. Every citizen of the realm invited to attend the coronation of Queen Jessamine Valdros. Roads opened, inns subsidized, a celebration for the kingdom, a celebration for the woman who had taken Sable's place. No, that was not fair. Jessamine had not taken anything. She had been given what Sable had refused, what Sable had walked away from, what Sable had surrendered in the dark on a night 4 years ago when she had decided that love was a luxury she could not afford. The crown was placed on Jessamine's head by the high priestess. Silver metal on golden hair. The hall erupted in cheers so loud the stones seemed to vibrate. Jessamine's gown caught the candlelight like liquid metal, and she looked every inch the queen she was born to be. Sable watched and felt nothing but a vast, hollowed-out grief that had long since stopped hurting and started simply existing, like a second skeleton inside her chest. And then Oriella pulled free of her grip. The child moved fast, the way only small children can, slipping between legs and gown hems with the fearless agility of someone who did not understand that there were places in the world she was not allowed to go. Sable lunged after her, but the crowd was too dense. She pushed through bodies, murmuring apologies, her heart climbing into her throat as she caught glimpses of dark hair weaving forward, always forward, toward the front of the hall, toward the dais, toward the king. No, Sable whispered. No, no, no. Alpha King Kaelin Drakemere stood on the dais in ceremonial armor, tall and broad, and carved from 4 years of grief he had never been allowed to show. Sable saw him, and the pain that cracked through her chest was so sudden and so savage she nearly stumbled. Oriella reached the steps. She climbed the first one with the fearless confidence of a child who had never been told she could not. A guard moved toward her, then hesitated, because she was so small, so clearly harmless, that stopping her felt absurd. She looked up at the king and said, in a voice that carried across the stone chamber like a bell, "Father, why is that lady wearing Mother's crown?" 1,000 people heard it. 1,000 people turned to look at Sable. And the Alpha King, whose face had been carved from granite for 4 years, whose control had never once cracked in public, looked down at the child and went completely white. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was what happened after. What happened when the court realized the king had a daughter he had never claimed. What happened when Sable tried to reach Oriella and a guard caught her arm, and the king's voice rang out across the hall with a single word that shattered everything. Stop. Not directed at the guard, not directed at Sable, directed at himself, like a man trying to halt his own unraveling. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. This moment, this catastrophic, irreversible, world-splitting moment, did not happen in a vacuum. It started 4 years earlier, on a night when the rain would not stop, and a seamstress with steady hands was summoned to mend a tear in the king's ceremonial cloak. She should have refused. She should have sent someone else. She should have done anything other than walk into that room and look into those eyes and let the thread of fate stitch her life to his. But she did not, and nothing was ever the same. 4 years earlier, Sable Thornfeld had precisely 3 things to her name: a bone needle that had belonged to her grandmother, a rented room above a tallow shop that smelled permanently of rendered fat, and a reputation for being the only seamstress in the lower quarters who could mend silk without leaving a trace. It was the third one that ruined her life. The summons arrived on a wet evening in late autumn, carried by a palace runner who looked like he had drawn the short straw and resented it. The message was simple: a tear in a ceremonial garment. Needed before dawn. Come immediately. Sable almost laughed. Palace work paid well, but palace work also meant entering a world that had never wanted people like her. The lower quarters existed beneath the notice of the court the way roots exist beneath a tree. Necessary, invisible, stepped on without thought. But the coin would cover 2 months of rent, and her landlord had started leaving notes under her door that were less polite each time. So she packed her mending kit, pulled her shawl tight against the rain, and followed the runner through streets that grew wider and cleaner the closer they got to the palace. The servants' entrance swallowed her into a maze of corridors that smelled of beeswax and bread. A steward named Hadrell, a thin man with kind eyes and a permanent stoop, met her at the door and walked her through the back passages. "The garment is in the king's study," Hadrell said, not looking at her. "His Majesty may or may not be present. If he is, do not speak unless spoken to. Do not look at him directly. Do not linger." "Understood," Sable said, her mouth dry. Hadrell paused at a heavy oak door, knocked twice, and opened it without waiting for a response. The room beyond was warm and lamplit, lined with books and maps and the faint smell of cedar. A ceremonial cloak hung over the back of a chair, deep black with silver threading along the collar, and even from the doorway Sable could see the tear. A clean rip along the shoulder seam, the kind that happened when fabric was pulled too hard across a frame that was too broad for it. The king was not supposed to be there, but he was. Alpha King Kalen Drakemere sat behind the desk with his head bent over a stack of documents, a pen moving in sharp, efficient strokes across the page. He did not look up when the door opened. He did not acknowledge Hadrell or Sable, or the fact that a stranger had just entered his private study. Sable had never seen him this close. From a distance, at public addresses and harvest processions, he was an abstraction. A tall figure in dark clothing with a voice that carried authority, the way stone carries weight. Up close, he was overwhelmingly real. The breadth of his shoulders, the hard line of his jaw, the way his presence filled the room like heat from a forge. She forced her legs to carry her to the chair where the cloak hung. Her hands found the fabric on instinct, fingers reading the weave, the weight, the tension of the thread. She could fix this. She could fix this with her eyes closed. Her hands were shaking anyway. She sat in the chair beside the cloak and opened her kit. The bone needle caught the lamplight as she threaded it, and the familiar motion steadied her. One stitch, then another. The rhythm of the work pulled her out of her fear and into the quiet, focused place where nothing existed except thread and fabric and the geometry of repair. She did not realize she had started humming until the pen stopped. The silence hit her like cold water. She looked up, horrified, and found the king staring at her. Not with anger, not with irritation, with something she could not name. His dark eyes held hers for a span of 3 heartbeats, and in that span Sable felt the ground shift beneath her. Felt something deep in her chest turn over like a key in a lock she had not known existed. Then he looked away, back to his documents. The pen resumed. Sable's heart hammered so hard she was certain he could hear it. She forced her attention back to the cloak. Stitch after stitch, precise and invisible, the tear closing beneath her fingers like it had never been. She was nearly finished when she heard his breathing change. It slowed, deepened, the pen trailing off mid-word. She glanced up carefully. The king's eyes had closed. His head had tipped forward slightly, and the rigid line of his shoulders had softened. He was asleep. Sable stared at him. She had been in his study for less than 40 minutes, and the Alpha King had fallen asleep at his desk. Something about that felt deeply wrong. Not wrong as in dangerous, wrong as in sad. The hollows beneath his eyes were purple dark. His skin had a grayish cast that spoke of exhaustion so deep it had settled into bone. She finished the last stitch in silence, knotted the thread, and snipped it clean. She packed her kit, stood on quiet feet, and moved toward the door. Hadril was waiting in the corridor. His gaze flicked past her to the open door, and his eyes widened. "Is he asleep?" Sable whispered. Hadril's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Shock. Disbelief. Something that looked almost like hope. "How long?" he asked. "Maybe 10 minutes. He just drifted off." The steward gripped her arm, not roughly, but with an urgency that startled her. "Listen to me carefully. You will not speak of this to anyone. Not your friends, not your family, not your neighbors. Do you understand?" Sable nodded, bewildered. "It is just sleep. People fall asleep." Hadril's expression told her she was wrong about that. Very wrong. "Go home," he said. "And do not be surprised if you are summoned again." Sable walked home through the rain with the king's coin heavy in her pocket, and a feeling in her chest she could not shake. That look he had given her, the way the world had tilted. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she would never see him again. She was wrong about both. 3 days later, another runner appeared at her door. Another summons. Another garment that needed mending. When she arrived at the palace, Hadril led her to the same study, sat her in the same chair, and the king was there again, working at his desk like she did not exist. He fell asleep within the hour, and when Sable rose to leave, Hadril was waiting in the corridor with a look on his face that told her this was no longer a coincidence. It was a summons she would not be allowed to refuse. The summons became a pattern. Every 3 or 4 days, a runner would appear at the tallow shop with a garment and a pouch of coin. Sable would walk to the palace, sit in the king's study, and mend whatever had been placed on the chair. The king would work at his desk. He would not acknowledge her. And within the hour, he would fall asleep. By the 4th visit, she had stopped believing this was about the mending. Hadril confirmed it on the 5th night. He pulled her into a side corridor, glanced both ways, and spoke in a voice that barely carried. "The king has not slept properly in 2 years," Hadril said. "Since his father died. Since the weight of the crown settled on him. Every healer, every herbalist, every remedy the court physicians could devise has failed." Sable pressed her back against the cold stone wall. "And you think I am somehow the cure?" "I think you are the only person in whose presence he has slept for more than 15 minutes in over 700 nights," Hadril replied. The number hit her like a physical blow. 700 nights. She thought of his gaunt face, the grayish pallor of his skin, and felt ill. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. "What you have been doing," Hadril said. "Sit, mend, let him rest. But we need to understand why it works. The court physicians want to observe." And so the arrangement formalized. Sable was given a room in the servants' wing so she would not have to walk the lower quarters at night. The physicians watched from behind a screen in the study, took notes, measured the king's breathing and pulse while he slept. Nothing changed when they were present. The king still slept only when Sable was in the room. He still woke within minutes of her leaving. The physicians tried isolating variables. They had her wear different clothing, use different thread, sit at different distances. They had her hum and then not hum. They had other seamstresses sit in the same chair, mending the same garments. None of it worked. Only Sable. She tried not to think about what that meant. Tried not to think about him at all, in fact. which was difficult when she spent 3 hours a night listening to him breathe. She noticed things she wished she had not. The way he rubbed his temples when the headaches came, pressing his fingers hard as if he could force the pain out through bone. The way his handwriting deteriorated as the night wore on, sharp and precise at sunset, barely legible by midnight. The way he never ate in front of anyone, but she would sometimes find crumbs on his desk in the morning, evidence of meals taken alone in the dark. She noticed that he never once asked her name. It should not have stung, but it did. She was furniture to him, a function that happened to produce the side effect of unconsciousness. He did not care who she was, only what she could do. And then one evening, 6 weeks into the arrangement, he spoke to her. "The hem," he said, not looking up from his work. "On the cloak you mended the first night. You used a stitch I have not seen before." Sable's needle froze mid-pull. "A lapped fell seam, Your Majesty," she managed. "It is a lower quarters technique, stronger than a blind hem, less likely to catch." Silence. She thought the conversation was over. "Who taught you?" he asked. "My grandmother." Sable swallowed. She was a sailmender on the river barges before her hands gave out. The king's pen paused. He looked at her then, properly, and she saw something shift behind his eyes. Not warmth exactly, but acknowledgement. The first recognition that she was a person sitting in his room and not merely a function. "What is your name?" he asked. Her throat tightened. "Sable, Your Majesty. Sable Thornfeld." He nodded once, slowly, and returned to his work. "Thank you, Sable." It was the first time anyone in the palace had thanked her for anything. She bent her head over the mending and blinked hard against the stinging in her eyes. After that, he spoke to her occasionally. Brief exchanges, nothing personal, always initiated by him and always about something she had done or said. He asked about the different stitches she used. He asked about the tallow shop and whether the smell ever faded from her clothing. He asked if she preferred candlelight or lamplight for close work. She answered honestly, too nervous to be anything other than truthful, and something in her honesty seemed to ease him. His shoulders would drop a fraction. His breathing would slow. The sleep came faster on the nights they talked. Sable told herself this was clinical, a cause and effect relationship she did not need to understand, only maintain. She told herself that right up until the night he fell asleep mid-sentence, and his head came to rest against the arm of his chair at an angle that would leave his neck aching for days. She stood, crossed the room, and carefully, so carefully, slid a folded cloth beneath his cheek to cushion it. His hand caught her wrist. She froze, her pulse spiking. His eyes were still closed, his breathing still deep, but his fingers were locked around her wrist with a grip that was gentle and absolutely unyielding. "Stay," he murmured, the word barely audible, dragged up from somewhere beneath consciousness. Sable stood there, bent over the king of the realm, his hand circling her wrist, her heart hammering against her ribs, and did not move. She stayed until dawn. When he woke and found her sitting on the floor beside his chair, her head tipped back against the armrest, he said nothing. But that evening, a proper chair appeared beside his desk, cushioned, with a blanket folded over the back. He never mentioned it. Neither did she. But when Sable sat down that night and ran her fingers across the soft wool of the blanket, she felt the unmistakable weight of being seen by someone who had no obligation to see her at all. And that, she realized with a sinking feeling, was far more dangerous than anything that had come before. The night it happened, there was a storm. Thunder shook the windows of the king's study, and the rain drove against the glass in sheets. Sable sat in her chair, her mending forgotten in her lap, watching the lightning carve white fractures across the sky. The king was not working. He sat at his desk with his hands flat on the surface, staring at nothing, and the weight that hung over him felt different tonight. Heavier. Darker. "Your Majesty," Sable said carefully. Are you unwell? He did not answer. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle working beneath the skin. His breathing was controlled, deliberate, the kind of breathing that took effort. Kalen. The name slipped out before she could stop it. His first name, spoken aloud in a room where she had no right to use it. His gaze snapped to hers. I am sorry, she said immediately. I should not have... Say it again, he said. Sable stared at him. The look on his face was something she had never seen there before. Not command, not authority, not the careful blankness he wore like armor. Desperation. Raw and terrifying and barely held together. Kalen, she said, softer this time. Something broke behind his eyes. He pushed back from the desk, stood, and crossed to the window. His forehead pressed against the cold glass. She watched his reflection, the way his hands fisted at his sides, the tremor that ran through his shoulders. 3 years on the throne, he said, his voice rough. My father ruled for 40. He made it look effortless. He slept 8 hours a night and woke with clarity. He knew every lord by name, every border dispute by heart, every treaty clause from memory. A pause. I cannot even close my eyes without the walls closing in. Sable set down her mending. What do you see when you close your eyes? The silence stretched so long she thought he would not answer. Fire, he said. The Northern Campaign. My father sent me to negotiate a truce with the Ashenmore clans. I was 22. I had never commanded anything larger than a training squadron. His breath fogged the glass. The negotiations collapsed. The Ashenmore chieftain, a man named Brannock, wanted blood, not peace. He raided a settlement called Thornhaven while I was still drafting counter-proposals. 43 families. I arrived too late. The fires were already dying. Sable felt cold spread through her chest. I see them, he continued, his voice flattening into something terrible and controlled. Every night, the ones who did not get out. I hear them. When I close my eyes, they are waiting. And I know what they want to ask me. What? Sable whispered. Why I was writing proposals while they were burning. The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Sable rose from her chair, crossed the space between them, and stood beside him at the window. She did not touch him. She could feel the tension radiating from his body, and she knew that one wrong word, one wrong gesture, would make him shut down completely. You were 22, she said, and you were trying to stop a war. I failed. You were trying. That is not failing. Failing is not trying at all. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see her with one eye. You sound very certain for someone who does not know the full story. Then tell me the full story, Sable said. And he did. Not all at once. It came out in fragments, raw and unpolished, the words of someone who had been carrying a weight for years and had never once been invited to set it down. He told her about Thornhaven, about the faces he remembered and the ones he could not, about the girl who had survived by hiding in a root cellar and who had looked at him afterward with eyes that held no accusation, only confusion, because she was too young to understand what had happened. He told her about his father's death 6 months later, the way the crown had been placed on his head before the grief had even settled, the way the court had expected him to step into his father's role seamlessly, as if kingship were a garment that could simply be put on. He told her about the sleeplessness, how it started as restless nights and then deepened into something relentless, something that felt almost sentient in its refusal to let him rest. The physicians say it is guilt, he said, trauma lodged in the body, but knowing what it is does not make it stop. Sable listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She did not offer solutions or platitudes, or the hollow comfort of telling him it was not his fault. She simply stood beside him and let him speak. And when he was finished, the silence that followed felt different. Lighter. You are the only person I have told, he said, and the confession in those words was almost more intimate than anything that had come before. "I will not tell anyone," Sable said. "I know," he replied. "That is why I told you." Their eyes met in the reflection of the dark window. Rain streaked the glass between their mirrored faces. Something passed between them that neither of them named, something that felt inevitable and terrifying and too large to hold. Kaelin turned from the window. He was standing very close. She could feel the warmth of him, could see the pulse jumping in his throat. "You should go," he said, but he did not move away. "I should," Sable agreed, but she did not move either. The space between them shrank, not because either of them stepped forward, but because the distance simply became unbearable. His hand came up and touched her jaw, a feather-light contact that sent a tremor through her entire body. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the war between what he wanted and what he knew was right, and she recognized it because the same war was raging inside her. "This cannot happen," he said, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "I know," she whispered. "You are—" He stopped. Whatever he had been about to say, he swallowed it. His hand dropped. He stepped back. "Good night, Sable," he said, and his voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. She left the study on legs that barely held her. In the corridor, she pressed her hand over her racing heart and tried to breathe. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and replayed the feeling of his fingertips on her jaw until the sensation was burned into her memory like a brand. In the morning, Hadriel found her at breakfast and sat down across from her with a face carved from worry. "The king has requested that your arrangement be extended," he said carefully. "He wants you moved to the room adjoining his chambers, a permanent position. You would be on call every night." Sable's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. "He is also betrothed," Hadriel continued, his voice dropping, "to Lady Jessamine Valdros. The announcement is expected within the month." The words hit her like ice water. "The match has been arranged since before his coronation," Hadriel went on. "A political alliance. The Valdros family controls the eastern territories. The marriage secures the border." Sable set her spoon down. "Why are you telling me this?" Hadriel looked at her with those kind, tired eyes. "Because I have watched him look at you, child, and I have watched you look at him. And what is coming will hurt you both very badly if you are not careful." That night, when she entered the study, the king was waiting for her. Not working. Just waiting. "I hear congratulations are in order, Your Majesty," Sable said, her voice perfectly steady, perfectly controlled, perfectly brittle. The flash of pain that crossed his face was so brief, she almost missed it. "The betrothal is a matter of state," he said. "Of course," Sable replied and sat down and picked up her mending and did not look at him again for the rest of the night. He did not sleep at all. The betrothal was announced on a Sunday. The court celebrated. Sable mended a torn tablecloth and tried not to feel anything at all. She failed completely. Lady Jessamine Valdros arrived at the palace 2 weeks later. She was everything Sable was not. Tall, where Sable was slight. Golden-haired, where Sable's was dark. Poised and polished and born into a world that Sable could only enter through the back door with a needle and thread. Jessamine was also, Sable had to admit, genuinely kind. She greeted the servants by name within days. She asked thoughtful questions about the running of the household. She smiled easily and often, and the court adored her. Sable hated none of this. She hated that she could not hate any of it. The nightly arrangement continued. Sable sat in her chair in the study. The king worked at his desk. They did not speak about the betrothal. The night at the window went unmentioned. Neither of them acknowledged the way the air between them felt charged and fragile, like glass heated past its limit. But Sable noticed changes. He slept less deeply now. His rest was fractured, broken by sharp inhalations and sudden jerks of his head. Sometimes she would watch him sleep and see his hands clench into fists, his brow furrowing as if something behind his eyes was fighting to pull him under. One night, 3 weeks after Jessamyn's arrival, he woke with a gasp that sounded like drowning. Sable was on her feet before she knew she had moved. He was sitting upright at his desk, his chest heaving, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. His eyes were open but unseeing, fixed on something that was not in the room. "Kaelin," she said, "you are here. You are in your study." His gaze found hers. For a moment he looked at her like she was the only real thing in the world. Then the mask slid back into place. "I am fine," he said. "You are not fine. It is not your concern." The words landed like a slap. Sable straightened. "Of course, Your Majesty. My apologies." She returned to her chair, picked up her mending, and said nothing more. The silence that followed was the worst kind. Not comfortable, not even tense, empty. Like something that had been growing between them had been severed at the root. He did not sleep again that night. In the morning, she found Hadril in the corridor and told him what had happened. The steward's face creased with concern. "The nightmares are getting worse," he said. "The physicians believe the proximity is no longer enough. They think he needs physical contact." Sable's stomach dropped. Contact. A hand on his arm. Something to anchor him when the dreams take hold. Hadril hesitated. "I understand if you refuse. This was never part of the arrangement." Sable thought about the way Kaelin had looked at her in those first seconds after waking, the raw, unguarded desperation in his eyes, the way he had looked at her like she was oxygen and he was suffocating. "I will do it," she said. That evening, when the nightmares came, Sable crossed the room and placed her hand on his forearm. The effect was immediate. His breathing slowed. The tension drained from his shoulders. He sank deeper into sleep, his head tipping sideways until it rested against her hip, where she stood beside his chair. She stayed like that, one hand on his arm, his head warm against her side, and felt something inside her chest crack open like a seed splitting its shell. The tenderness that poured through the gap was so fierce it frightened her. She was in love with him. She had been for weeks, maybe longer, and she had been lying to herself with the same steady precision she used to mend invisible seams. The realization did not feel like falling. It felt like arriving somewhere she had always been heading, a destination she could see clearly now that she had stopped pretending she was walking in a different direction. She loved a man who belonged to someone else, a man who was marrying another woman for the good of his kingdom. A man who would never, could never, choose a seamstress from the lower quarters over an alliance that secured his borders. Sable stood in the dark with her hand on the king's arm and let the truth of it settle into her bones. She would stay as long as he needed her. She would help him sleep. She would keep his secrets. And when the wedding came, she would leave quietly, the way she had entered. Through the back door, without a trace. It was a good plan. A sensible plan. The plan of a woman who understood her place in the world and did not presume to occupy more of it than she had been given. It lasted exactly 11 days. On the 11th night, Kaelin did not go to his desk. He stood in the center of the study, waiting for her, and when she entered, he crossed the room in 3 strides and kissed her. It was not gentle. It was not careful. It was the kiss of a man who had been holding his breath for months and could not hold it for one more second. His hands cradled her face, his mouth moved against hers with a hunger that consumed every rational thought she possessed, and Sable kissed him back with everything she had because she was tired of pretending she did not want this more than she had ever wanted anything. They did not speak. Speaking would have meant acknowledging what they were doing, and acknowledging it would have meant stopping. So they did not stop. The rest of the night belonged to them alone, and for a few stolen hours the world shrank to the warmth of his arms and the steady drum of his heartbeat beneath her ear, and the feeling, overwhelming and undeniable, that this was where she had always been meant to be. Afterward, she lay against his chest in the firelight, listening to him breathe, and thought, "This changes everything." She was right, but not in the way she expected. In the morning, Kalen's face was a mask. "Last night was a mistake," he said, not looking at her. "It cannot happen again?" Sable felt the words carve through her chest. She nodded once. She gathered her things. She walked to the door with her back straight and her chin up, and her heart in pieces on the floor behind her. "I understand, Your Majesty," she said. She did not return to his study that night. Or the next. Or the next. On the fourth morning, Hadriel found her. "The king has not slept in 4 days," he said quietly. "He is deteriorating. Badly." Sable closed her eyes. "He has also dismissed the physicians. He says he does not want anyone in his rooms." Hadriel paused. "He asked me to tell you specifically not to come." "Then I will not come," Sable said, but her hands were shaking, and the ache in her chest had grown into something that made it hard to breathe, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was lying. She went to him anyway. Not that night. She gave him 2 more days, partly out of respect for his wishes and partly because she needed time to find her courage. But on the 6th night, when Hadriel told her the king had collapsed during a council meeting and had to be carried to his chambers, Sable stopped waiting. She walked through the palace corridors at midnight with nothing but her mending kit and a stubbornness that bordered on recklessness. The guards at his door exchanged uncertain glances when they saw her. "He gave orders," one of them said. "I know what orders he gave," Sable replied. "Let me through." Something in her face must have convinced them, or perhaps they had seen enough of the king's decline to know that turning her away was the greater risk. The door opened. His chambers were dark. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in a dim, reddish glow that made the walls seem to close inward. The air smelled stale, the windows shut tight, the heavy curtains drawn. Sable could taste the sleeplessness in the room, a sharp, metallic tang that clung to the back of her throat. Kalen was in the bed, not sleeping. Lying on his back with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling with the fixed, hollow gaze of someone who had forgotten what rest felt like. He did not react when the door opened. He did not react when Sable crossed the room and stood beside the bed. The toll of 6 days without sleep had carved him into something barely recognizable. His cheekbones jutted beneath skin that looked almost translucent. The hollows beneath his eyes had deepened to bruised crescents so dark they looked painted on. His hands lay flat on the sheets, trembling faintly, and the tendons in his wrists stood out like cords. "I told you not to come," he said. His voice was raw, scraped thin, the voice of someone who had been arguing with his own mind for days and losing. "You did," Sable agreed. "And yet here you are. Here I am." Silence settled between them, heavy and fragile. "You are killing yourself," Sable said. "I am protecting you." "From what?" "From me." He turned his head to look at her, and the anguish in his eyes made her breath catch. "From what I will do to your life if you stay. You deserve better than being a king's secret. Better than whispered rumors and closed doors, and a life lived in the margins of someone else's story." Sable sat on the edge of the bed. He flinched but did not pull away. "You think I do not know what I am?" she asked quietly. "A seamstress. No name, no family, no rank. I have lived in the margins my entire life, Kalen. That is not new." "It should be," he said fiercely. "You should have more." "What I should have and what I want are not the same thing." He stared at her. She watched the war behind his eyes, the desperate battle between duty and need, between the man he was and the king he had to be. "I am engaged," he said, and the word sounded like a prison sentence. "I know. Jessamine is a good woman. She does not deserve—" "I know that too." "Then why are you here?" Sable looked at him. At this man who carried a kingdom on his shoulders and a graveyard behind his eyes, and would rather destroy himself than risk hurting anyone else. This man who had kissed her like she was salvation, and then called it a mistake. This man who had not slept in 6 days because the only thing that let him rest was the thing he had forbidden himself to have. "Because you need me," she said. "And because I am tired of pretending that I do not need you." She reached for his hand. His fingers closed around hers immediately, convulsively, like a rope thrown to someone going under. A shudder ran through his entire body. "Stay," he whispered, the same word he had murmured in his sleep all those weeks ago. But this time his eyes were open, and the word was a choice, not a reflex. "I am not going anywhere," Sable said. She lay down beside him on top of the covers, fully clothed, her hand in his. She did not try to touch him beyond that. She did not push. She simply lay beside him in the dark and let her presence do what it had always done. Within 20 minutes, his breathing deepened. His grip on her hand loosened slightly as sleep pulled him under. The lines of pain in his face smoothed away one by one, and Sable watched him sleep and felt tears slide silently down her temples into her hair. She did not know what would happen in the morning. She did not know how to be the woman the king needed without losing herself entirely. But he was sleeping. And for now, that was enough. She closed her eyes. And for the first time in 6 days, she slept too. She woke to voices in the corridor, sharp, urgent, getting closer. The door burst open. Sable sat up, disoriented, squinting against the sudden flood of morning light. Kaelin jerked awake beside her, his body going rigid. Jessamine Valdras stood in the doorway. Behind her, 2 of her ladies. Behind them, Hadriel, whose face was white with horror. The silence that filled the room was absolute. Jessamine's gaze moved from the king to Sable to their joined hands on the rumpled sheets. Her expression did not crumble. It did not crack. It hardened. Slowly and completely, like wet clay fired in a kiln. "I see," Jessamine said. Her voice was perfectly controlled, perfectly calm, perfectly devastating. "Jessamine," Kaelin started. "Do not," she said, raising one hand. "Do not explain. Do not apologize. Do not insult me by pretending this is something it is not." She turned and walked away. Her ladies followed. The click of her heels on stone faded down the corridor like a countdown to something irreversible. Sable sat in the king's bed with the morning light turning everything harsh and real and felt the ground open beneath her. "What have we done?" she whispered. Kaelin did not answer. He sat on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands, and the silence between them was no longer charged or fragile or electric. It was broken. What followed was the worst month of Sable's life, and she had lived through some terrible months. Jessamine did not break the engagement. That was the part Sable had not expected. The Valdras family controlled the Eastern Territories. The political alliance was larger than any scandal, larger than any betrayal, and Jessamine understood power well enough to know that walking away would cost her family more than staying. So she stayed, and the court, which had loved her from the moment she arrived, closed ranks around her like a fortress. Sable became the enemy overnight. The whispers followed her everywhere. The seamstress, the climber, the lower quarters woman who had clawed her way into the king's chambers and his affections. The servants who had once been friendly now looked through her as if she were not there. The cook served her food last and cold. Her room was reassigned without notice, and she found her belongings stacked in the corridor outside a storage closet that smelled of damp stone and turpentine. She moved into the closet. She did not complain. Kaelin tried to intervene. He issued orders. He demanded Sable be treated with respect. But a king cannot legislate kindness, and the court's cruelty was too subtle, too pervasive, too deeply woven into every glance and whispered conversation to be addressed by decree. They still met at night. Sable still sat in his study, and he still slept in her presence. But the ease between them was gone. replaced by guilt and caution and the constant awareness that every moment they spent together was a wound they were inflicting on someone who did not deserve it. "You should send me away," Sable said one evening. Kaelin looked up from his desk. The weariness in his face had returned, not as deep as before, but present. A reminder of what happened when she was not near. "No," he said. "Jessamine deserves better than this. I know. And so do I." The words hung between them. She watched them land, watched the way they cut into him, and felt sick for saying them even though they were true. "What do you want?" he asked, and the question sounded like it cost him everything. "I want you to let me go," Sable said, "or I want you to choose me. But I cannot live between those two things any longer. It is killing me." He was quiet for a very long time. The fire cracked. The wind pressed against the windows. "I cannot choose you," he said. "The Alliance. I know about the Alliance. My kingdom needs—" "I know what your kingdom needs." Sable's voice did not waver. "I am asking what you need." He looked at her with eyes that held so much pain she could barely stand it. "You," he said. "I need you. But I cannot have you, not the way either of us wants." Sable nodded. She had known this was coming. Had known it from the beginning, really. Seamstresses did not end up with kings. That was not how the world worked. That was not how any world had ever worked. She stood. She packed her mending kit with steady hands. She crossed to the door and paused with her fingers on the handle. "Then this is goodbye, Kaelin," she said without turning around. She heard him stand, heard his chair scrape against the floor, heard him take one step toward her, then stop. Sable. "Do not," she said, echoing Jessamine's words from the doorway a month ago. "Do not make this harder." She opened the door and walked through it and did not look back. She left the palace that same night. She packed the few things she owned into a canvas bag, slung it over her shoulder, and walked out through the servants' entrance into the dark. No one stopped her. No one noticed. She was, as she had always been, invisible. She was 3 streets into the lower quarters when the truth she had been carrying for 2 weeks became impossible to ignore any longer. The tenderness in her body, the nausea that arrived with each dawn, the bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with heartbreak and everything to do with the new life taking root inside her. She was pregnant. She had known for 14 days, and she had not told him. She could not tell him. If he knew, he would try to keep her, and if he kept her, the alliance would crumble. And if the alliance crumbled, the eastern border would fall, and people would die. Real people. Families like the ones in Thornhaven who still burned behind his eyes every night. Sable would not be the reason more people burned. So she walked into the dark with her grandmother's needle and a secret growing beneath her heart, and she did not look back. Not once. She told herself it was the right thing, the noble thing, the selfless thing. She was wrong. But she would not learn that for another 4 years. 4 years is a long time to disappear. Sable built a life in Kaelworth, a coastal town far enough from the capital that the king's name was spoken like a weather report, distant and impersonal. She rented a room above a chandler's shop, took in mending work, and gave birth to a daughter she named Oriella. Oriella had her father's eyes, dark and serious and far too observant for a child her age. She had his jaw too, the stubborn set of it, and his way of watching people with an unblinking focus that made them shift uncomfortably in their seats. Sable loved her with a ferocity that frightened her sometimes. This child was everything. The proof that what had happened in that palace had been real, had mattered, had produced something beautiful even if it had been born from something impossible. She did not speak of Kaelin, not to Oriella, not to anyone. When Oriella asked about her father, which she did with increasing frequency as she grew old enough to notice that other children had them, Sable said only that he was a good man who lived very far away. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. but it was all she had. The announcement arrived on a Tuesday. Not a palace runner this time, but an official courier bearing the royal seal. Every citizen of the realm was invited to attend the coronation of Queen Jessamine Valdros. Attendance in the capital was encouraged. Roads would be opened, inns would be subsidized. Sable read the words and felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. She should not have gone. Every rational thought in her head screamed at her to stay in Kaleworth, to keep her head down, to let the past remain buried. But Oriella was 3 years old and had never seen the capital, had never seen the palace where she had been conceived, had never seen her father's face except in the shape of her own reflection. And Sable, despite 4 years of silence and distance and ruthless self-discipline, had never stopped loving him. The ache had not faded. It had calcified, hardened into something she carried in her chest like a stone, heavy and permanent and impossible to set down. So she went. She told herself it was for Oriella. She told herself she just wanted to see the city one more time. She told herself 1,000 lies, each one thinner than the last. The capital was transformed for the coronation. Banners hung from every building. Flowers lined the streets. The crowds were so thick that Sable had to carry Oriella on her hip just to keep from losing her in the crush of bodies. They found a place near the back of the coronation hall, pressed against the wall behind rows of nobility and merchants and guild leaders. Sable wore a borrowed dress, her hair pulled back, her face unremarkable in the sea of thousands. No one looked at her twice. And then the ceremony began. She saw him the moment he entered the hall. 4 years had changed him. He was broader, harder, his face carved into sharper angles by the weight of the crown. But his eyes were the same, dark and serious and carrying something behind them that the rest of the world was not meant to see. He looked tired. Not the desperate, hollowed-out exhaustion she remembered, but a quieter weariness. The fatigue of someone who had learned to function without rest, who had accepted sleeplessness as the price of his choices. Sable's chest ached so badly she pressed her fist against it. The ceremony was long. Jessamine walked the aisle in silver, regal and composed, and when the crown was placed on her head, the hall erupted in cheers. Sable watched and felt nothing but a vast, empty grief. Then Oriella pulled free of her grip. It happened so fast. One moment the child was beside her, and the next she was gone, slipping through the forest of legs and gowns with the terrifying agility of a 3-year-old who had spotted something interesting and could not be reasoned with. Sable lunged after her, but the crowd was too dense. She pushed through bodies, murmuring apologies, her heart climbing into her throat as she caught glimpses of dark hair weaving forward, always forward, toward the front of the hall, toward the dais, toward the king. "No," Sable whispered. "No, no, no." Oriella reached the steps. She climbed the first one with the fearless confidence of a child who did not understand that there were places in the world she was not allowed to go. A guard moved toward her, then hesitated, because she was so small, so clearly harmless, that stopping her felt absurd. She looked up at Kaelin, and said, in a voice that carried across the stone chamber like a bell, "Father, why is that lady wearing Mother's crown?" The silence was instant and absolute. 1,000 people heard it. 1,000 people turned to look at the woman pushing through the crowd with horror written across her face. Kaelin looked down at the child, at her dark eyes, so like his own, at the stubborn set of her jaw, at the shape of her face, which was his face rendered in miniature. He went white. His gaze lifted, found Sable in the crowd, and the expression that crossed his face was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Not anger, not betrayal, recognition. The bone-deep, staggering recognition of someone who was seeing the truth for the first time and understanding in a single, devastating instant exactly how much it had cost. "Stop," he said, not to the guard who had reached for Sable's arm, not to the crowd, to himself. like a man trying to halt his own unraveling. Then he moved. The Alpha King of the realm stepped down from his own coronation dais, crossed the space between the throne and the crowd, and knelt in front of a 3-year-old girl he had never met. "What is your name?" he asked, and his voice broke on the last word. "Oriella," the child said. "What is yours?" A sound escaped him that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. "Kaelin," he said. "My name is Kaelin." Oriella studied him with those serious, dark eyes. "You look sad," she said. "I am," he replied, "but I think I am about to be less sad." He looked up at Sable, who had reached the edge of the dais and stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, unable to move or speak or breathe. A guard still had his hand on her arm, and Kaelin's gaze went to it with a flash of something dangerous before the guard released her and stepped back. "4 years," he said. "You kept her from me for 4 years." "I was protecting you," Sable whispered. "The Alliance. The border. I could not—" "You were protecting everyone except yourself," he said, and the grief in his voice was immeasurable. He stood slowly, Oriella's hand in his, and faced the court. 1,000 faces stared back at him, shocked and scandalized and riveted. "This is my daughter," he said. His voice carried the way it always had, with the weight of stone and the certainty of a man who had stopped pretending. "And this," he looked at Sable, "is the woman I should have chosen 4 years ago." Jessamine stood on the dais behind him, the crown still on her head. Sable forced herself to look at her and braced for fury, braced for hatred, braced for the cold, controlled devastation she had seen in that doorway 4 years ago. Instead, she saw relief. Jessamine's eyes were bright with tears, but her chin was lifted, and the expression on her face was not that of a woman who had been betrayed. It was the expression of a woman who had been set free. "I knew," Jessamine said quietly, and the words were meant for Kaelin alone, but the hall was so silent that everyone heard them. "I have always known. You never looked at me the way you look at her. Not once." She reached up, lifted the crown from her own head, and held it out. "Give this to someone who has earned it," she said. The hall erupted, voices clashing, outrage and astonishment, and something that might have been hope if hope could be that loud. But Sable heard none of it. She was looking at Kaelin, and he was looking at her. And between them stood a little girl with her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, holding both their hands. "I am sorry," Sable said. "I know," Kaelin replied. "So am I." He pulled her to him and kissed her, there on the steps of the coronation dais in front of 1,000 witnesses, and it was not gentle or careful or proper. It was the kiss of a man reclaiming something he should never have let go. Oriella tugged on his sleeve. "Does this mean we are staying?" she asked. Kaelin looked down at his daughter and smiled, really smiled, for what looked like the first time in years. "Yes," he said, "you are staying." The crown was not placed on Sable's head that day. That was not how these things worked, despite what the stories said. There were councils to convene, treaties to renegotiate, a political landscape to reshape. The Valdras alliance did not crumble. It transformed. Jessamine, freed from a marriage she had never wanted, brokered a new trade agreement with the Eastern Territories that proved more durable than any union of convenience could have been. She and Sable never became friends, but they became something quieter and perhaps more honest. 2 women who had been placed on opposite sides of an impossible situation and had both chosen dignity over bitterness. The court took longer to come around. A seamstress as queen was an absurdity to some, an outrage to others, and a quiet revolution to the rest. Sable weathered the whispers the way she had always weathered hardship. With steady hands and a straight back, and the bone needle her grandmother had given her, which she kept in a glass case in the royal chambers as a reminder of where she had come from. Kaelin slept now. Not perfectly. Not always peacefully. The ghosts of Thornhaven still visited him on the worst nights, and the guilt did not vanish simply because he had chosen love over duty. But Sable was there, every night beside him, her warmth anchoring him to the present. And Oriella, who had started all of this by climbing a step she was not supposed to climb and saying a word she was not supposed to say, grew up in a palace full of people who would eventually forget that her mother had once mended their clothes. She had her father's eyes, she had her mother's hands, and she had a stubbornness that came from both of them, which meant that the kingdom, for better or worse, was in for quite a future. On quiet mornings, Sable would wake before the rest of the household and sit by the window of the royal chambers with her mending in her lap. Not because anyone required it, but because the rhythm of needle and thread still steadied her the way nothing else could. And sometimes Kaelin would stir, reach across the empty sheets, find her gone, and murmur her name in his sleep until she came back to bed. She always came back. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you very soon for the next one.